Chapter 21, The Age of Reform. So in this chapter, we will be covering progressivism, the progressive mind, the political reforms that took place, and the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. So we're starting with the roots of progressivism. And it's important to remember that the progressives were not really a single unified group. They weren't seeking a single objective. The movement arose from many different places, and the reform groups were seeking many different things. All of them were forward-thinking, but that's about their only commonality. Some of them wanted civil service reform. Some of them wanted political reform. Some of them wanted the government to regulate big business. Some of them wanted the government to bust up trusts or to enact antitrust legislation to prevent monopolies. And some were still fighting for improved conditions in the workplace. And so these movements came from all over. In 1899, there were 1,200 firms that were absorbed in mergers. And so that means that the growth of the monopoly was on the rise. And people who considered big business evil demanded that the government break up these trusts. And their fear was that one of these industries might take over 100% of their market and then drive the price of whatever their good was way up. And so that was the fear. So in 1898, President McKinley launched the trust-busting era, and he appointed the U.S. Industrial Commission to carry this out. And Theodore Roosevelt would spend a lot of his presidency trust-busting as well. And so your prominent trusts during this time are Standard Oil, that's Rockefeller, U.S. Steel, Carnegie, and then J.P. Morgan, American Tobacco Company, James Buck Duke, for whom Duke University is named, and then the International Mercantile Marine Company. And so there were several of these firms that presented the real threat of turning into a monopoly. And so the interesting thing is that a lot of these reformers came from different classes or different realms of people. There were religious leaders, there were college professors, there were lawyers, there were members of the middle class and the working classes. And they were concerned with the changes brought on by industrialization, and they were influenced by the intellectual currents of the day. College boards particularly feared the direction of their institution coming under the sway of wealthy trustees. What if Carnegie, donated millions of dollars to a university, and then he wanted to have a say in what their curriculum was like? Pastors who were used to moral deference and their flock respecting them and listening to what they were saying were challenged by their materialistic middle-class flocks who didn't pay them very well on top of that. So this was definitely, the progressive era, and it wasn't, again, one unified group or one unified movement. It was just a bunch of movements happening all at the same time. So the muckrakers. So the popular press at this time began to publish articles on social, economic, and the political issues of the day. And one of the first to do this was a magazine called McClure's. And McClure's magazine published, her name was Ida Tarbell, but Ida Tarbell's critical series on Standard Oil and Lincoln Stevens' expose on city machines. And so they were trying to expose the corruption of these big companies, and it caused a wave of sensationalism and stirred the people to progressive action. There were political cartoons that demonized trusts and showed them taking over whole cities. And pretty soon, other editors realized that this was a moneymaker, so they rushed to adopt McClure's formula. And there were armies of journalists who published stories exposing labor gangsterism and the adulteration of food and drugs and corruption in college athletics and even prostitution. And this degree of sensationalism used by some of these authors prompted Theodore Roosevelt to label them muckrakers. And so this would actually later become a term of honor. But yeah, this was definitely an age of muckraking. The progressive mind. What was in the mind of the average progressive? Well, the progressives thought that humans were innately civil and they were innately humane, and that it was these large institutions that corrupted them. And so progressives sought to protect the weak, the women, the children, the poor, from the strong, like the unscrupulous business owners. And progressives, again, came from all walks of life, and they included great tycoons, small operators, advocates of social justice, prohibitionists, and many others. Progressivism, though, never really challenged the fundamental principles of capitalism, and it didn't seek to reorganize the basic structures of society. Many progressives actually held anti-immigrant views, and very few progressives concerned themselves with the plight of African Americans. And so if they had joined with socialists, reform might have come a little bit faster for them. Wisconsin was actually the most progressives of the state, but they would not cooperate with the Socialist Party of Milwaukee, so they were slower to reform. Radical progressives. There was a small group of progressives who were radical, those who were influenced by the European revolutionary theories. And one such person was Eugene Debs, and he would run on the socialist ticket for president in several elections, but never come close to a majority. But in 1905, Eugene Debs and a group of mining, or a coalition of mining and other unions and socialists and other radicals formed a new union, and it was called the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW. And so they were openly anti-capitalist, and probably in part for that reason alone, they never attracted the support of mainstream labor. And they tried to start various strikes, sometimes successful, sometimes not. But overall, this was not a huge movement and was not as successful as it was in some places in Europe. So that brings us to political reform, the cities first. There were corrupt political machines that ruled many cities. And I know in chapter 20 we talked about city bosses, and San Francisco, for one, was led by a powerful lawyer named Abe Roof, I probably said that wrong, Roof, who made tons of money working out deals with urban renewal companies. But, while he was in office, prostitution and alcoholism flourished, and he and his men engaged in corrupt business deals. And city bosses and machine politics became the primary targets of progressivism. And there were even editors from McClure's who would travel, or journalists from McClure's who would travel to the big cities to report on these political machines. Reformers could not defeat the machines without changing urban political structures. They had to change the structure of city government in order to do anything about this problem. And so new forms included quote-unquote home rule. And home rule gave the local authorities more power to deal with local issues instead of having to rely on the state. There were also nonpartisan bureaus, and the nonpartisan bureaus investigated government problems without regard for political parties, hence nonpartisan. And then a city management system was put into place. In Ohio, for instance, the city management system established a minimum wage for the city, or for city employees. They built playgrounds, they built golf courses, and they tried to moderate the harsh penal code in the area. So some of these experiments at the municipal level, they included urban renewal, the municipalizing of public utilities, and public transportation systems and reform of penal institutions. And there was some success there, and there were instances where they were able to cut down on the corruption in city government. So political reform at the state level. There was corruption and mismanagement at the state level as well. And there was a guy from Wisconsin who probably best illustrated progressivism in action at the state level. And his name was Robert M. La Follette. Maybe French, I don't know. But among his reforms were the adoption of direct primaries, the Corrupt Practices Acts, and laws that would limit campaign spending and the funding of lobbyists. La Follette also advocated state regulation of the railroads and the management of natural resources. And this became known as the Wisconsin idea. And there were many other states who adopted at least certain elements of the Wisconsin idea as well. And some even went beyond Wisconsin in making their governments responsive to the popular will, with the adoption of the initiative and the referendum. And a referendum is just a general vote by the populace on a single political question that has been referred to them for a direct decision. So rather than letting legislatures decide, they allow the people to vote on the issue. State social legislation. So by the 1890s, many states had passed laws regulating conditions in the workplace. And for the most part, they restricted child labor. They set a maximum hour or a maximum set of hours for women and children. And they regulated conditions in sweatshops, that sort of thing. But there were conservative judges who were unwilling to accept an expansion of the state's coercive power. And they often struck down laws like that on the grounds that they violated the, quote, due process clause of the 14th Amendment. For instance, the 14th Amendment guaranteed the rights of blacks, but it also forbid the state to deprive blacks of their rights and gave justices the right to overturn laws that deprived employers of their, quote, liberty to determine how long a workday should be. And so there were a series of Supreme Court cases that overturned laws like this. So for instance, in a court case called Hammer versus Dagenhart, there was a child labor law that was passed by Congress that was overturned because it deprived the employer their right to establish however long of a workday he wanted. And then a similar thing happened in Adkins versus the Children's Hospital, where there was a minimum wage law in place for women in D.C. that was also overturned. And they were referring back to the 14th Amendment, which said, employers are deprived of their liberty to determine how long a workday should be. So progressives did achieve state legislation in regulating transportation, utilities, banking. They, had the government regulate the insurance industry. But this piecemeal regulation by the states really failed to solve the problems of an increasingly complex society. The progressive era saw the culmination of the struggle for women's suffrage, or the right for women to vote. And, the women's movement was handicapped by a couple of things. The first one was there was a rivalry between the NWSA, which was led by Stanton and Anthony, and they wanted equal rights beyond just voting, and the AWSA, which focused only on suffrage. This movement was also hampered by the Victorian attitudes about the role of women. Victorian attitudes were that women should remain sexually inhibited, no birth control. They needed to keep up with the image of purity and quietness and loveliness. They were also inhibited by the applications of Darwinian theory. Women were supposedly morally superior. And so feminists attempted to turn ideas of women's moral superiority to their advantage in the struggle for voting rights. And in doing that, they actually surrendered the principle of equality by saying that they were superior. So in 1890, the two major women's groups they came together and they formed the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. And the first two presidents were, of course, Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. But there were some new leaders emerging. At any rate, the growth of progressivism continued to contribute to the cause of suffrage. And after they won the right to vote in several states, the NAWSA focused its attention on the national level. And so eventually, the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, and this finally granted women the right to vote in all of the states. So we'll go ahead and end our video lecture here, and we will pick up with Theodore Roosevelt, Cowboy in the White House, on the next video.